Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. Senator, what a morning. Talk to me about what is at stake for Americans, and what the president chose to do this morning.
Right. Well, we are in a housing crisis in America, and the cost of housing is just too high. And the principal reason for that, we're not building enough housing. So we have worked for well over a year, Republicans and Democrats together, and we have put together a housing bill that has nearly 50 provisions that are all designed to increase housing supply and therefore bring down costs. There's also a provision in it to say to private equity, for the first time ever in America, this is one industry. You can't come in here and take over our neighborhoods, sell them off to Wall Street, and turn us into a nation of renters. The bill has passed the Senate by a huge majority. It's passed the House by a huge majority. And about 2 minutes ago, we were all supposed to be down in the rotunda while Donald Trump signed it into law. But Trump has now said, nope, he's not going to do that. You know what that says to me? It says to me that Donald Trump just doesn't care about the cost squeeze on American families. This is the guy who said affordability is a made-up word that Democrats came up with. Affordability is a hoax. He said about inflation, he loves the inflation. Yeah, he does. He doesn't care about high prices for millions of people across this country. What he does care about is Donald Trump and nothing else. And that's what today's cancellation of the signing ceremony is all about.
I think it's fair to say you're frustrated. Is Senator Scott as frustrated as you are?
You know, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I really do want to say that Senator Scott has been a terrific partner in making this bill happen. Republicans and Democrats worked together. And, you know, here's the amazing thing, Alicia. We didn't just water everything down so nothing matters, you know, a study or a blue ribbon commission. There's a lot of meaningful provisions in here. And not everyone applies to every city, because this is not about the federal government coming in and saying, okay, here are the 49 things you need to do in your town. It's about saying, here's a lot of different stuff you could do. So, for example, it will make manufactured housing cheaper, on average about $10,000 a unit, because we remove a chassis requirement. It will make it possible for cities and towns to pre-approve plans and have plan books so that someone can come in, a builder or a family, and say, I want to build on that basic structure, and they're through. The permitting process goes faster. It has changes in environmental regulations to smooth them out, make them happen faster. It has a provision in it to say federal dollars that come into cities, cities that are building more housing are going to get more federal dollars. Cities that are building less housing are going to get fewer federal dollars. So it's got a lot of different pieces. It'll work some in rural, some in urban, but it's there to help us build more housing supply in America. For Republicans, we're all tweeting about how terrific it is right up until the moment Donald Trump said that he's not coming.
Senator, let's talk about what he is holding this legislation hostage for. Yesterday in Pennsylvania, the president plugged the SAVE Act. Take a listen to what he had to say.
And in the Save America Act, it's very simple. All voters must show a photo, voter ID. Very nice. May we see a picture, please? All voters must provide proof of citizenship. And there will be no mail-in ballots except for illness, disability, military deployment, or travel.
So allow me to do a quick fact check on that, and then I'll get your response on the other side of it, which is you have critics who say this idea of show me your papers to vote is going to keep eligible citizens from voting. This is from the Brennan Center for Justice. Half of Americans don't even have a passport. 9% of American citizens of voting age, or 21.3 million people, don't have proof of citizenship readily available because it's in a safety box or with another family member. At least 3.8 million don't have these documents at all because they were lost, they were destroyed, they were stolen. All of a sudden, if all these folks can't participate in our democracy, what happens?
Yeah, that's the whole point. Donald Trump seems to think that the way he and the Republicans will win elections is to keep American citizens from voting, at least keep certain American citizens from voting. That's his entire plan. And you know why he's doing that? Because he's losing. And he knows he's losing. Look, Donald Trump pays attention to the polls. He knows that his polling is where? Down in the 30s? He knows that he is tying his Republican Party to losing message. He knows that Americans across this country look out and say, he's made $2 billion on crypto. His kids are out there scamming money off being related to the President of the United States. People are sick of the corruption. They're sick of the chaos, and they're sick of the policies that Donald Trump is using to drive up costs. The tariffs that have driven up costs, the energy policies that have driven up costs, the health care changes that have driven up costs, and a war halfway around the world that has driven up costs. He is in trouble. And instead of changing his policies, instead of doing what the American people need and want, he's off saying, I'm going to keep a bunch of them from voting. And that's what he's thrown down on. This is Donald Trump trying to subvert democracy because he understands that democracy is not going to be in favor of Donald Trump and the Republicans come November.
Just to real quickly go back to the housing legislation, as we were coming on air, Speaker Johnson says he still thinks the president will sign this bill into law in 10 days. Do you agree with that assessment? If he's going to do it in 10 days, why not do it now?
I don't have any idea. I mean, really, if you're asking me to assess what Donald Trump is going to do, all I can figure out is, well, if there's a way for Donald Trump personally to make money off it, I can predict he'll do that. If there's a way for his close-in buddies to make money off it, I predict he will do that. And if there's a way to rile up some extremists in the country and divide people, I predict he'll do that. Other than that, I'm out of Donald Trump predictions.
Okay, Senator, let me ask it a different way. I am old enough to remember when the president called you on your cell phone because he understood that you had your finger on the pulse of populist America. He was pitching you on this idea that the two of you could work together on things. You managed to get the majority of his caucus to sign on to this legislation. So let's forget about Donald Trump. What do you do about this legislation?
This legislation will pass, and it will pass one way or another. Either we will pass it now, or understand this, Democrats have been fighting to lower costs for a long time now. We understand that Donald Trump promised that he would lower costs on day one, and now here we are on day 500 and whatever, and he's walking away from trying to lower costs. The cost of groceries are up, cost of health care is up, cost of utilities is up, cost of gasoline is up, cost of everything is up because of Donald Trump's policies. But Democrats, we are on top of this. We have shown that even when we are not in the majority in the House, we are not in the majority in the Senate, and we sure as hell don't own the White House, that nonetheless, we put our heads down, we put our shoulders to it, and we deliver to lower costs for American families. We win in November and we are in the majority, then we can do a whole lot more to lower costs. And lowering costs is the job right now of the United States Congress and the President of the United States. His job should be to sign off on that.
There's this debate that it's a meta debate, but that's been happening about whether Democrats ought to be focusing on the economy, whether they ought to be focused on democracy. There are lots of folks who say you can do both. You can tie them together. It would seem that this moment when there was about to actually be delivery on the economy being held hostage because of Donald Trump's threats to democracy actually puts the picture in stark relief.
Yeah. You know, but that's really the thing here. I don't take any joy in this. I want this bill passed. I want to start the steps of lowering the cost of housing for millions of families across this country. Do you understand that today, a first-time homebuyer in America is now, on average, 40 years old? 40 years old, and that's because the cost of housing has just gone nuts. Today, in a place like Atlanta, private equity has just moved in. Last year, they bought 1 out of every 4 homes that went on the market for sale. Private equity, Wall Street investors snapped them up. And then you know what that means. It means for a young family that was hoping to be able to buy a home, or a family that's growing and hoping to move up to the next home, they get cut out by somebody who's an all-cash buyer and can close by next Thursday. So this is bad for home buyers, but it's even worse for renters, because when private equity moves in, they don't just buy like 1 house in Atlanta and 1 house in Boston and 1 house in Kansas City. Nope. They come into a city and buy in that city so that they own a big share of the rental housing. And the data already show when private equity does that, they then push up the rents, push up a bunch of junk fees, stop doing maintenance, and then beat down on renters who are a day late on paying their rent. They are miserable landlords. And you can't move somewhere else because their whole plan is to buy up as close as they can to all of the rental property. This bill, if Donald Trump would sign it, this bill to stop private equity would be law. That's what we've hammered out here. Something that is good for Americans all across this country, buyers and renters. And Donald Trump has turned his back and said he just doesn't care.